right, welcome to episode 454, coming at you from a hotel room in Orlando, Florida, where tonight I will be speaking, moderating a panel, doing a little comedy, jokes in support of the Florida Education Association, the largest teachers union in Florida. Longtime listener, friend of mine, and now president of the organization, Andrew Spar, has again invited me down here to moderate a panel, do a little comedy. Very excited to be joining him and all of the amazing educators, and also got to hang out with a few listeners as well. Thank you to Steve Courtney, Barry Hummel, Benny Alexander, all hung out, had a few beers last night here by the pool at the hotel in Orlando. Very fun. Great getting to hang out with those guys. Andrew Spar also joining us for a little bit, and loved it. Love meeting you guys and look forward to meeting more. I'll include a picture in the show notes for all of the stand-up subscribers. If you're not a subscriber, go right now. Standupwithpete.com or patreon.com/Pete Dominic. Okay, I have an awesome guest joining the show today. Like I said, no news today because I'm on the road, no way to do it, but I'm really excited about my very special guest who is joining me. Last Saturday night, I was on MSNBC talking about several issues, including comedian Dave Chappelle's new special, which has been considered very controversial for what is being interpreted by many as transphobia. He calls himself transphobic, as a matter of fact. Somewhat tongue-in-cheek, maybe, but lots to talk about it. And so to prepare myself to go on MSNBC to talk about an issue that I am not a member of the community of, but do have some credibility, knowing Dave a little and doing comedy and talking about it from a comedic point of view. I did a lot of research and prep, as I try to do when I'm given this platform or a bigger platform like MSNBC, and to do right by it. One of the people whose videos I watched on YouTube was someone named Jessie Gender, and she is a brilliant trans woman who is in Seattle, who has a pretty popular YouTube presence. And her videos are excellent. They are so well produced, and she's so good at explaining it. Description on her YouTube channel, Jessie Gender. She also describes herself, she identifies as a total nerd and a dork. She's a big, giant Star Trek fan. She talks a lot about that in other videos and channels. But on this channel, she talks about nuance in the nerdy and focus on issues facing the LGBTQ community, transgender specific community, women, non-binary, and autistic folks, as well as other social and political issues through and within geek topics with an eye to the most vulnerable. She writes, "My goal is to try to create a space where we can talk about hard issue, but in a way that it's constructive, positive, welcoming, and educational, and still never loses sight of the joy and love for each other that brought us together in the first place." That's the description on her YouTube page, and that is why I became a fan and a subscriber and supporter of her work, and very excited to have her joining me to do what she's doing on those other platforms here on Stand Up. All the links to her social media are in the show notes, but you can find her on Twitter at Jessie Gender, Instagram, I mentioned YouTube. I learned so much from this conversation. I know so little about the trans folks, trans community, trans issues. We talked about surgeries, we talked about drugs, we talked about sex and orgasms, and so much more. Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time on the show, and you can support her on Patreon as well, Jessie Gender.
Here we go. I've got Jessie now. I've just told you all about her or they. Let's start with pronouns, Jessie. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to talk to you. I watched so many of your videos. They helped me get ready for my appearance on MSNBC, and I'm so happy that you agreed to come on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And you did a great job on MSNBC, by the way. I watched it after you reached out, and you did a wonderful job, and I'm happy that I was able to help in any way on that.
Yeah, I felt like I'm big on this idea of intersectionality, and I'm glad when they have a diverse panel, which that was, but we were talking about trans issues without a trans person. I'm always conscious of that, and so I thought, well, my intersectionality or credibility, if I have any, is I'm a comedian, but you know what? Anybody can talk about comedy. You don't have to be a comedian to talk about comedy. But still, I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't know what he was talking to. So I just lifted a whole bunch of your stuff. And now here I am giving you that credibility. So hopefully people know that's where Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I mean, that's what those videos are there for people to like learn and have a chance to like, oh, now I have a good broad understanding of the context of a situation, and then go forth and help other people learn as well. Like that's the.
And that's why I'm such a big fan of your videos. You give so much context. You give all the arguments that you're arguing. You give as much of the research as you can. You share personal anecdotes. It is such an educational and entertaining YouTube channel. And I don't know that much about YouTube. I desperately want to be as good as you are at it someday. But I just have to highly recommend, if people aren't into YouTube, or they are, Jessie Gender is the channel. Is that the best way to find it? Yeah?
Yeah, if you look up Jessie Gender, that should get you there.
Many good videos. And, you know, I think part of it is because not only do you identify as a trans woman, but tell me about the autism, where you identify on the spectrum there.
Yeah, so I identify, it was basically like, they call it like high functioning autism, but essentially just on the autism spectrum. And there's like many different ways to sort of talk about autism in like sort of a spectrum way. For me, a lot of the ways that my autism presents is hyperfixations. So as I don't know if people are just listening to this on audio, but I have a bunch, if you look at my videos, I have like a bunch of like Star Trek and nerd crap in the background. So it's like, oh, I get super focused on nerdy stuff and try to learn all the minutia of that. But then also it helps out with like issues like this, where when I'm learning about trans issues, I'm like, I have to know everything. And it actually, it's always stressful when making the videos, because it's like, oh, I wish I could make like the people who make videos on YouTube. They're like 10-minute, like quick little hot takes that give the information. That like the little pieces of stuff that you can just sort of say easily. But I have to be someone who's like, no, if I'm going to talk about a topic, I'm going to give you literally every piece of information that I have, which sometimes doesn't do well for the algorithm gods. But it is, I think it's, as you say, it's like, it's helpful to be like, hey, this is the broader context that this discussion sits within. And, you know, my goal with that sort of stuff is never to come across as like, I'm here to judge somebody or be angry at somebody. I always sort of assume someone's going to come in with no knowledge, but just wanting to learn. And so I come from that assumption. And so I try to give you everything that you need to know from there. Well,
I think that's a really, really great assumption when it comes to all things trans. It's super helpful that that's how you approach it. And I do sense that. You don't have, like, you're not there to be angry and even judgmental. You're seemingly as open-minded of a person as you can be on the issues that desperately impact your own life. And I think that's the most important type of teacher that we can learn from. So let's get into it and let's talk about all of it. But let's just do the pronoun thing first, because I mentioned it, and then I want to talk your origin story. I know you're into origin stories and sci-fi and everything. So
definitely.
I don't like they because it's plural, and I can't remember that. You're just one person, but it is the obvious alternative. But that's dehumanizing because it makes you not sound like a human person. I'm not dying on this hill. I'll do whatever I'm told. I'm just being honest. I want to call anybody whatever they want, gender-wise, name-wise. If you want to be called Axel McGee, whatever, you name it. But
now I want to be called Axel McGee. Can you call me that for the rest of the year?
Yes, I can. Done. Axel, help me understand they.
Yeah, no. For they, I mean, there's a few things we could talk about with they. I mean, I totally understand the thing about, like, we mainly think of they as like a multiple form. I mean, the reason you sort of encounter me was Dave Chappelle's special. I actually think Dave Chappelle had a really funny joke in the special where someone said, like, they're after you, and he said one day or multiple days, which is actually really funny because I feel like that's honestly a confusion that I think a lot of people get to.
Yeah.
And I totally understand it. And so, a couple things with it. The first thing with they is, well, number one, in our language, we actually don't use they just for plural. Like, for example, like, let's say you're driving a car and someone almost hits you, and it's like, they're such a jerk, but you're talking about one person, even though you're using they there. So they can actually be used singularly. We tend to use it singularly in our conversations when we don't know the gender of somebody. So like, oh, I was just talking to them, if you're like someone on the phone, something like that, or they were just being kind of a jerk to me. You're still using it as a singular.
Right.
So we do actually so they is actually still singular within our language. But the second thing, even if we sort of ignore that, this is actually one of the things that is limiting about the English language specifically. Because if you look at a lot of like other different languages, there are other languages that do have singular pronouns just as part of the like language. And so we tend to think about how language actually helps us define how we understand the world. We tend to think like, oh, the language is how we describe the world, but how we actually think in certain languages helps us see the world. Like, for example, there are certain cultures that have more words for the color red than we do. And as such, they're actually able to distinguish more colors of red. Like if you and I just looked at a color red, we would see the same color red, but they would be like, oh, that one's actually slightly different, because it changes how we see the world. And so the reason I bring that up is because our language is so limited in terms of how we think about like gendered words, we tend to think things as very binary in terms of gender. But there are other cultures that actually have more pronouns than just he, she, and then technically they. And so you could, those other cultures tend to see more binaries, see things in less binaries, see have more genders, things like that. Basically, the point that I'm getting at is, number one, they is more than just multiple. We can use it singularly in our language. And number two, it is a limit of the language that we're just trying to, basically we're trying to put a Band-Aid on our language in order to try to use what we already have in order to recognize that there are people that fall outside the sort of gender norm between male and female.
Very, very well explained. And this is exactly why I love love your channel, which also includes a ton of, quotes and effects and so much more in addition to this. You're not even getting the full Jessie Gender here because we're just having the conversation, but you have so many other tricks up your sleeve on the YouTube channel. All right, my next question, I want to get to you and your personal stuff a little bit, but my next question is just, I want to get this right. So I keep often saying on the record, on air, that even within the trans community, there's quite a bit of disagreement about several different things. Is that a fair thing to say? I mean, it's always fair to say that any group of people is not monolithic. I get that. But because trans is, I don't want to say new, and you can push back and correct me, but it's new to a lot of people, and certainly the language around it and the research around it, I think, is fairly new as well. And so there are, within the trans community, there's a lot of difference of opinion, even with kind of rhetoric and language, much less culture, identity, and the way forward, much less activism. Is it fair to say that there's a lot of disagreement in the trans community on several different things? And is that probably true of all communities, though, too?
I mean, it's most definitely true of all communities. I mean, no community is monolithic ever. But yeah, no, I think there's a lot of different ways you could break down the trans community. I mean, as you say, like trans people have been around since the beginning of history. Like I could point to like there was even a Roman emperor that many people assume was trans. We wouldn't necessarily describe them that way because we didn't have the language to say they were trans at that time. And again, it goes to like the evolution of language and how we grow things, as I was talking about before. But in terms of like today, as you said, like the reason that there's more reasons than this, but a lot of the reason that there's a lot of, disagreements and different thoughts within the trans community is because while trans people have always existed, research and language around trans people is just now becoming more mainstream in our culture, in sort of modern culture. And so because of that, it's always constantly evolving. Like, for example, you can break down along age lines. Like I know people from about 20, 30 years ago don't actually, some people do, but there are some trans people who would say, I don't like to use the word transgender. I like to use the word transsexual because that's what I grew up with. That's what I understand. I sort of see myself this way. There are some trans people who find that word to be sort of outdated and not in use, but they can have that sort of thing. And then there's also like the typical culture war stuff. Like there are people who will like fall on political lines. Like, I mean, if you look at me versus like Caitlyn Jenner, without getting into the specifics of that, but she and I have vastly different views on politics and things like that. So there's definitely like a whole spectrum. I always tend to say that like the trans community, because trans people can come from any different culture in any different place. So there are Black trans women, there are Asian trans women, there are trans men, we're all a cross section of different identities and intersectionality. And so because trans people are just as diverse as anyone else in any other community, I would say our opinions are just as diverse.
How would is there a general definition or way to describe what it means to identify as trans?
Again, there's a lot of different thought on this, but the general way that we see used in academia, all trans means is not identifying with the gender that you were told you were at birth. So for me, I was, born and I was told I was a boy. I don't identify with that. I identify more as a woman. And so that makes me trans. And then I'm also so I'm a woman, I'm trans. And so I'm a trans woman. But all the word trans it has nothing to do with anything. It's just like, I don't identify as the gender that I was told to be at birth. That's the basic meaning of the term. And then there's the sort of opposite of that, which is cisgender, which some people consider to be a slur, but it's just because of our culture war stuff, like tend to think like you hear the word cisgender in heated culture war conversations, but all the word cisgender means is you identify as the gender you were told you were birthed, like you were told you were a boy, you know, you were born, seen, and raised as a boy. That was like, hey, that fits me like a glove. So that would mean you're cisgender.
To be fair, I did request at age 6 to be called Shelby, which is fairly androgynous. So I don't know where I was going with that, but nobody once called me Shelby. Then I said Mark. I don't know why Mark. No one would call me Mark. And then finally I made it easy. I said, I want to be called PJ now. My middle name is James, PJ. And again, nobody would even give me the time of day with any of those requests. But I think that it's really important to also just pull back the curtain on one more ignorant thought I sometimes say, and maybe it's not ignorant, and just push back where this. There aren't that many people who identify as trans. It has become such a massive issue because of a lot of manufactured horror about trans people. And so trans folks are pushing back on that. Policy makers are pushing back on that as well. But like trans people, in terms of the rights that you're fighting for, it's not that big of a movement. It's within a larger movement, and there's a lot of allies. But I think about, it's not like homosexuality even. There's tons of, everybody knows people are gay, and you may know someone who's trans and not know it, and so on. But my contention is that there's not so many trans people, and we've made it an issue that's gotten way more attention than it deserves, mainly starting with things like the bathroom law, which you have an amazing video about. But also, you know, it just seems like it gets way too much attention because of the negative things, the hate against it. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the amount of attention it gets, the amount of attention it should get, and the type of attention it gets in terms of how big of an issue it is. And obviously, if you're a trans person or close to a trans person, it's the most important issue for you. But my less controversial point is there's a reason we don't talk as much about cystic fibrosis as we do cancer. And and sorry for the barbaric comparison.
No. I mean, like I said, I mean, we were even talking about this before we went live. It's like, the question is, I always think as long as you're asking a question of earnest, like curiosity, regardless of whether you frame it in a like imperfect way, the question comes from earnest curiosity. So it's totally fine to ask the question. And yeah, to sort of get at that, it's like, yeah, trans people make up, I mean, there's different estimates of the population, but it's the like biggest that I saw is that we make up maybe 1% of the US population. And that's like the biggest number. So yeah, for sure. There is a disproportional amount of like attention paid to the trans community. And part of that is unfortunately a lot of scapegoating of the trans community as like the transgender agenda and the transgender menace.
Yeah. You have a great thing that you do on your YouTube show, making fun of the phrase. I mean, you could say any blank agenda because it's so often, but
the gay agenda,
trans agenda. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, exactly. I mean, like I mean, as soon as they come out, they hand us all a notebook and with all the rules and everything that we have to do.
The agenda is overhead projector.
We're gonna get everybody with a trans agenda. It's a definite thing. But no. But yeah, no. I mean, I think part of it's scapegoating. I mean, a lot of people, I mean, it's the same thing we saw with just the gay people in general, LGBTQ people in general, just like a few years ago, where it's just like, oh no, beware the gay people. They're going to try and make your kids gay. They're going to try and, harm your kids. And it's like, no one's asking for that. We're just like gay people just asking to get basic respect, not to be insulted in public and to have the right to marry like anybody else.
No, they're going to, the thing you hear the most is still, unfortunately, they're going to force their gay agenda down your throat, and you're like, I think you're projecting. I think you want it, maybe.
Yeah, I
think maybe you want the gay agenda down your throat. Who talks that way?
I mean, how dirty can we get on this podcast?
As dirty as you want. No, please. As dirty as you want. But it's just like I'm just thinking about how I never have said you're forcing your conservative bullshit down my throat. I've never used the phrase down my throat. It wouldn't occur to me. So I just think it's hilarious when you're talking about sexual orientation and then saying forcing it down my throat. It always seems to me like a hint of projection. Yeah.
There's the phrasing is not great.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
Anyway.
But yeah, no. What was I saying? I
don't know. Let me ask you a different question because I don't know if you were done with your point. I interrupted with that anyway.
No.
Which is, let's get to kind of your personal. You can use your own personal experience to talk about, and then you can talk about the data and so on it. But another kind of ignorant question to some extent, but the gay, you have a certain feeling at some point about your sexual orientation, no matter where you are on it. You like girls, you like boys, you like everybody, you don't like anyone, whatever. Leave it open for anything. That's an urge of sexual orientation. That's much different than gender. And I think that it's really important to obviously separate those. But you do have the same experience. You're a child, developing a human child in the world. At some point, you start to feel, I feel like this. I identify with that. And I always wonder about nature versus nurture on such things. I don't care if it's a choice. I don't think that should matter at all. But my understanding is that such things are not choices. But what is your personal journey? What was your childhood like, Jessie? And then to the science, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different ways we can even think about it. I mean, for me personally, I knew when I was really, really young that there was something like off. I didn't really, again, because the language around being trans was so new and very cordoned off and was not part of the mainstream consciousness, even like when I was growing up 20 years ago. I just knew that there was something off. Like we don't really gender kids all that much until we get to like 5, 6, 7. So when I started noticing like, oh, the girls were sort of being pushed off into their own little areas and getting to do their own thing. And when boys are starting to go off in this way, I started being like, oh, I kind of resonate with that over there with like what they're doing, getting to play with dolls and things like that. And not that I necessarily think that like girls have to play with dolls or anything like that, but I know I resonated in that way.
By the way, everybody played with fucking dolls. Everybody. Yeah. They were just, exactly. I had tons, and dolls were my favorite toy. G.I. Joe, Star Wars, and pro wrestling dollies. I had all of them.
Hey, I had a mermaid that fought with the Power Rangers fairly regularly and kicked their ass. So there we go.
Now that's ridiculous that the mermaid could take on the Power Rangers, but you do you.
I mean, come on, we all get to make our own universes. It's fun. But yeah, no, I mean, but for me, yeah, no, growing up, it was just like, I just sort of like knew that was like something was off, something felt off. And I would like, just like started to feel really bad about it. And just as I grew older and older and things started getting more and more obviously gendered and pushed my way, I just felt more and more uncomfortable and started even feeling kind of depressed about it. Until I started researching things, like I would sneak up in the middle of the night to like look up, when other kids were looking at porn, I was looking at porn and trans issues. So, I was like, I would sneak up in the middle of the night and like use my mom's computer to just look up like what is transgender, and find different websites and just sort of learn about it. And I'm like, oh, this applies to what I'm feeling. Eventually got to the point where in college, I wasn't able to express with anybody. And I got to the point where, we don't have to go too deep into this, but it was a really difficult time where I was very thinking about suicidal thoughts and things like that. And it was either I come out or something worse happens. And I decided to come out. And I was very lucky on that I had friends that accepted me and sort of helped me with that.
That's probably uncommon for most people, at least at that time when you did. It's changing, but that's got to be a huge part of it. And just a quick question there, which is, you probably didn't have like many, if any, role models. Like I think part of this is changing for the better, it would seem, but like you feel really alone. You're like, am I the only, all kids feel that way when they're really little. They think they're the only person who's ever, gone through whatever they're going through. But as you get older, you realize that's different. But at the same time, when you look around the world and you don't see anybody or hear anybody or know anybody that's dealing with what you're dealing with, am I on to anything? Was that?
Yeah. I mean, like the only, especially, again, as you say, it's been changing the past few years. But, when I was growing up, the only thing I really had was like anytime someone would like do something transgressive with gender. So like, I'm even thinking like Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, which is terrible representation for numerous reasons. And I know like that even the movie states like he wasn't actually trans, but like when you're a young kid, you look at that and you're being like, oh, someone's playing with gender sort of thing. And you're told that you're like criminals, that all these people are criminals, or you see a lot of sex workers in media that are transgender, which is, there are a lot, because transgender people are often so marginalized, they often have to go into sex work.
Or worse, but at best, they're broken.
Mm-hmm.
They might not be violent criminals, but they're broken people, which is why they are trans.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's sort of hinting at like, oh, only broken people can be trans. Only trauma causes trans people, or if you come out as trans, you're only going to experience hardship and hellishness. And so when you're young like that, it's you don't really, and you don't have any role models, you sort of like wonders like, am I wrong? Am I terrible? Is there something bad about me because of this? Which isn't true. Like, being trans is part of, this is something that I want to like, I think I was going to try and mention earlier, but like, we tend to think of like being trans as like this wholly different experience. Like, because I'm trans, my experience is unrelatable to a lot of people. But I think in a lot of ways, we should also talk about, while we do need to talk about trans people as a group of people that are marginalized, are politicized, are legislated against, I also think like we can talk about how everybody, I think, relates to gender in different ways. Like, I mean, even as you were saying, you were joking earlier, like when you were younger, whether you were just joking or not, but like having different names that you wanted to use for yourself, and like having people address you in different ways. Yeah. Or like think about how we talk about tomboys, like girls who grow up to be tomboys. Like, they're girls who still identify as girls, but are playing within how they wish to express their gender, how they wish to show off the gender. I think all of us, especially when we're younger, going through puberty or even before puberty, are all playing with gender to figure out how we present in the world. And so I think trans sometimes can be thought of as, again, a group of people that are marginalized and politicized, like I am as a trans person. But I think we can also think about how all of us are trans because we're told to be a certain way from birth. Like, there's some sort of like, boys are told to be tough, masculine, like a Hercules sort of thing. Girls are told to be demure, kind, thoughtful, like should cry a lot, things like that, be open with their emotions. But not everyone is like that, even if they are identifying as the gender they are from birth. And so I think all of us sort of move away or align with typical gender norms. And I think all of us have that aspects of ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, we do right up. The most obvious thing we do is the way that we dress. Mm-hmm. My favorite one would be like, if a dude went to work at a place where, in an office where it's business casual, whatever, let's say pants, shirts, if that dude ever wore open-toed shoes, it would be really outrageous, and people would be grossed out by it. Yet at the same office, the women wear open-toed shoes, and it's considered completely appropriate and fine. And we don't even have to go past the ankle to get to that. It's
exactly the sexy ankle, as Victorians like. Oh my, yeah, so much ankle.
Yeah, I mean, like, we can talk about like we can have a lot of fun with just the idea how how comfortable a skirt is on a hot day. But like it didn't make sense, which is why Arab men wear dashas and stuff like in more arid climates. But whatever. I mean, like, there's so much to talk about how we all just comply every single day to gender norms, and it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. I'm not judging. I'm just saying clearly we are all sheep to some extent here, except for those that are the most nonconformist. And so, when it comes to trans, let's get to let's get to vaginas and penises.
My favorite subject.
You are so good. I watched your video. I was so many of your videos enlightened by this. You're so open about your own journey, your own medical procedures, and what they all mean. And I really haven't heard this conversation as openly as I've wanted to. So I'm happy here to host it and get your take on it. So again, with your personal journey, if you don't mind, you've talked about it so much in your channel. What happens? What happens next when you come out and you identify as a woman now, and then what?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways to start this conversation. For me, a lot of people focus on this specific type of journey that I had, which was I had what's called gender dysphoria. So when I looked at my body when I was younger, I could see certain aspects of it that like made me feel upset, anxious, depressed, namely like having a penis. And it wasn't even like, it just was part of me that like I didn't have any connection to or feeling like I was happy with it. It made me feel uncomfortable a lot of the time. And so for me, I decided to go through transition in a specific way. And that is seeking certain medical procedures like hormones, which help with things like they help to grow breasts. They help to, use our estrogen, that sort of stuff. For me, I also decided to get a vaginoplasty, which is they basically take your penis and turn it into a vagina. We can get into all the fun details of all of that, and I'm happy to if you ever wish to. But that was sort of my journey. And the reason that I did that is now, after having hormones, after having that surgery, I feel happier and more comfortable in my body. When I have, to get into the nitty gritty, when I have sex, I feel like more aligned with that. Like when I had sex before I had surgery, it was not something that I felt comfortable with or it felt like a good thing for me to be doing. I just didn't feel comfortable or resonate with it. It was just sort of like a thing. It was like, oh, this is gross. And so I just feel happier in my everyday life. And it's not just about sex. It's just like existing in my body. I feel happier now. Well, and I feel, yeah.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
No, please.
That makes, I think that's the most important point, is that sexual satisfaction is super important, and certainly important to me. I think it's important to most people who are sexual beings, and it's just a part of you. And most of you is not a sexual being. Most of you is going to be satisfied by all of the rest of the day, frankly, or week. And yet I still struggle when I heard you talk about this, the surgeries you've had, because my main, I guess, not only, I'm sure I have a lot of more questions, but my main question was, didn't you worry that you would not have a similar sexual satisfaction post surgery? Like that scared. I remember where I was when I was listening to your YouTube channel while driving, and I remember where I was when I heard that, and I was just like, oh my gosh, that would be so terrifying. Because how can someone articulate, a physician, a scientist, the change? And you are someone who actually you can talk about what it's like to have a penis and a vagina and have sex, which makes you, I think, someone who should be a highly paid speaker. But I digress. I think that scared the shit out of me. Like, I would be terrified. I'm never going to have a similar feeling with sexual sex and orgasm, much less masturbation, which is most of it anyway for all of us. Come on.
Yeah, no, true. No, you're 100% right. Like, I mean, I'm not gonna lie. Like, there was that worry. Like, before having surgery, like, I think like the week, like, it was something I pursued for so long, and I knew that I didn't feel comfortable with the penis that I had. But then, like, the week before surgery, it was like, is this what I want to do? Is this right? Is this? I mean, I feel like no matter what surgery you have, unless it's like you're gonna die if you have the surgery, and if you don't have the surgery, I think you're always gonna have that worry. And even after the surgery, while I was healing, like, it took 2 years to, like, any surgery, it takes like a year, 2 years for swelling to go down, things like that. I was worried, like, oh, did I make the wrong choice? I couldn't. There's some thoughts of, once you have surgeries, some trans people won't be able to orgasm after surgery just because of loss of sensation, things like that, which is horrifying for many different reasons. But I also knew that, like, I knew what I was feeling right now was making me not feel happy, not comfortable in my body. And so I decided to pursue this. And yes, there's always going to be some level of unsureness, tepidness. I mean, every single one of us, no matter what surgery it is going to feel that way. But I also knew that where I was at, like, I jokingly said, going to die, but it's like, I was living in a lot of depression and sadness up until when I started transitioning, which helped. And then the surgery, which helped even more. And so I was like, this is what I have to do to try it. And I'll be honest, like, what's fascinating to me now that, like, is sometimes hard to even think about back then is, after the surgery, after everything healed, there was this, like, rush of joy and happiness at that moment. But now today, it's just an everyday, like, I just get up and exist in my body. And honestly, that is the greatest win for me, in that, like, it's not like, hi, I'm high on my body every single day and, like, everything's, like, great and I'm super, it's like, no, I'm just existing in a way that makes me, I feel comfortable now with my body in a way that I never did before. And I think that the sort of normalcy that it settled into is what made me, what is, I think, the biggest win. And there is some fear that won't happen. And there have been some people who do detransition, but I do feel like the detransition narrative has been often overblown, often weaponized against the trans community, and that's a whole other topic.
Yeah, but and you've talked about, I mean, there's so much that you can talk about on any one of these things, and I hope that we can continue that, and people should just go watch your videos, of course, to learn more, because you're so good at it.
And I do want to say one thing, too, just on that, because I just wanted to address it, is, like, also with getting surgery, it wasn't just something that was, like, spur of the moment, too. I mean, obviously, I thought about it for years, but I also had a therapist. I talked to a therapist for over a year. For that surgery, you have to get 2 therapist recommendations, letters of recommendations, be on hormone treatment. So there are a bunch of, like, things to ensure that this isn't just like a spur of the moment sort of thing. So I just wanted to mention that because I'm
glad that you did, and I'm sure people have different journeys, but that sounds like a really super healthy kind of comprehensive one to make sure that when you're making such a life-changing decision. I mean, we should probably have those conversations about decisions that are less impactful. Can you have an orgasm before as a man and after a transition? And is it like similar to what a female orgasm would be? How do we know?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, like, this is the thing, too, that like a lot of people use, like people say, this is also a piece of rhetoric used against the trans community. They say like, oh, your vagina is just a mutilated penis. It's not the same as a cis woman's vagina, or as some people would say, a real woman's vagina. And I'll be honest, it's not. My vagina is not the same as a person who was born with vagina. It's just not. And I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I've never experienced what an orgasm is with a vagina that someone was born with. I don't know. What I can tell you is between the two types of orgasms that I have before and after, I feel way more comfortable with the orgasm that I have now with the vagina. I feel like it makes me happier. I feel more comfortable. I mean, there's different ways. I mean, we can get into the specifics of the differences of orgasms. Like with having a penis, it was just like one thing that happens, and there was a lot of cleanup afterwards, and it takes like a few seconds. With the orgasm that I have now, let me put it this way: it takes a lot more work to get there, but you can make them last a little bit longer, if that makes sense.
Well, it does, and it sounds pretty, much like a cisgender woman would have, but it also is yours. That's your, we all have our own, I suppose, orgasms as well. As similar as they are, they're probably different, and getting there is different too. I'm trying to think of a funny joke about how I get to mine. I have to be wearing. I got nothing right now. I have to be wearing.
I have
to be wearing a Jets uniform. But anyway,
I have to be wearing a Starfleet uniform for mine.
She's a Star Trek nerd. Should be noted for our listeners. So okay. So the other really super important thing I wanted to make sure we got to, at least in this first conversation, is the controversy over and the conversation around adolescence and transitioning, because this is a really difficult thing to talk about, much less to know about. Just the idea that how influenced, are young people being by role models, by culture, how much of it is within them, and what if they make a wrong decision, and at what point should surgery, much less hormone therapy, be considered? Is there a lot of controversy amongst the scientific and medical field around this, much less the trans community, much less those of us who have a bit less of a buy-in on it?
Yeah, for sure. This gets into really, really complicated territory that I've also done whole videos on, because this narrative has often been used against the trans community. I mean, it goes back to a similar thing with like gay folks were facing in general. It's like, oh, the gay folks are going to make your kids gay, sort of thing. But there is more to it with the trans community, considering that there are surgeries and things like that, which are incredibly scary. And I mean, for me, I came out as trans and I had my own journey. But after I came out as trans, a few years after that, my sister, who is younger than I am, she started to come out and think like maybe she was trans, and started saying like, I want to start hormones and things like that. And, my stepmom, had worries too. It's like, oh, is she influenced by you? Are you being a role model that might influence her to think that this is what's like fixing?
Sure. That's a fair assumption, right?
Yeah, it's 100% fair. 100% fair. And what a lot of people worry about, and is often certain groups like, trans exclusionary radical feminists,
TERF.
in certain groups, TERFs, exactly. They will often say like, what trans people want you to do is like have your kids start hormones when they're really young, when hormones cause irreversible changes, like, they can become sterile off of, especially for boys transitioning to be girls, they can, become sterile, things like that. Get surgeries like for, trans men getting, the breast removed, things like that. And that can't be reversed. That they're basically, TERFs are saying is like, trans people want your kids to get these immediately without any barriers, just quick, go get them right now, hand them out like candy. What trans people are actually saying, what we generally say is, take the time, like I did, to explore your identity. Take the time to understand. Like I told my stepmom when my sister came out that way, it's like, here's what you should let her do. let her go to Walmart or Target or the store, buy some boys' clothes. Let her wear, like, what's it going to hurt to like have her try that out and see if that makes her comfortable? Have her, if she says, can you try using he pronouns for me? Why not? If it makes her happier and it like it fits her and we can keep going down that, yeah, I didn't want my sister to, do anything that she was going to regret down the line, for sure. One thing that this issue has somewhat centered around, though, specifically, I think all those things are things that you can do for anybody without any worries whatsoever, other than maybe bullying at school. And that's a whole other conversation. But I think those are all safe things that we can just allow people to play within, like as we do with anybody, like girls who want to be tomboys, that sort of thing. The one thing that this conversation has somewhat centered around that we see with different laws in like Texas, the UK and stuff like that is puberty blockers. And what puberty blockers are drugs that you can give to kids, you typically around when they start puberty. And all it does is halt puberty so that when they go off of them, they'll start puberty like normal, maybe later on down the line. But when they're on it, they won't go through puberty in ways that will cause them to have irreversible changes to their body, like, growing breasts for young girls or, deepening of voices for boys, things like that. Things that you could not change. It's always better to start hormones before you've gone through puberty because of those changes that would have happened with puberty. So what most trans people advocate for is puberty blockers, just to give people more time, give kids more time to make that decision. People will say like, well, it's dangerous to give kids puberty blockers because they won't go through the puberty and that can harm their health. Most of the time, puberty blockers, the only science that we've found so far that puberty blockers are damaging is that maybe it hurts bone density growth if you're on it for a super prolonged period of time over several years. And that is a conversation totally we should be looking into the possible effects of puberty blockers. But generally, I would say like we worry about the damage of not going through a normal puberty, but I would say the damage that if you have a trans kid who does go through puberty and it ultimately gives them things that they don't want in the long run, like goes through their sort of natal puberty, the normal puberty, that is irreversible damage too. My puberty was, I alluded to it earlier, it was hell for me. It was like I was growing in from I don't think I was like objectively a bad looking guy or anything like that. But for me, it felt like I was growing into a monster. Like I felt like I was becoming this gross thing that I just couldn't stop every single day. And puberty is hell for all of us, I think. But
I'll tell you, my story quickly is I could not wait for it. And it took forever to arrive. I was last. It was brutal. I was like a little kid and late to puberty. I mean, I would look around. I used to think that your stature somehow accounted for when you went through puberty. Like if you were a smaller boy, I mean, you were going, but that wasn't the case. There were kids my size going through puberty. And my joke in my act is I went through puberty late and lost my hair early, which is a horrific overlap. And why I cursed God at that moment and left religion, period. But I also, like, I couldn't wait for it when it finally arrived. I was so happy about it. In terms of it being torture, I think you mean more about just adolescence in general rather than the act of going through puberty, which for I think most people is probably pretty not exciting, but like they're glad it's happening just because of conformity reasons. And then if you're a woman and maybe you're developing too quickly, or a man, there can be things if you're somehow outside, in my case, late, early. But I think probably most people, if they're within the normal time, it's probably, nobody wants to draw attention to themselves. But I think you're talking about just adolescence in general can be horrific.
Yeah, exactly. And so like, I think the larger point that I guess I'm trying to just get at is more just, I feel like there's a lot of this sort of misinformation about the trans community that we're like trying to harm kids and making kids into trans people and trying to put them in the trans box and then shunt them off into doing transitions really, really quickly, which is not the case. I think all trans people advocate for generally, and I'm sure there's different outliers. Again, the trans community is not a monolith, but right. I think what most trans people just say is just let any kids just explore in ways there are definitely ways to do it that are not definitive, like they have to make a decision now about something, but just let them explore as you would let them explore anything in life.
Is there an age when you think bioethically surgery is inappropriate?
I mean, I think, again, it depends on each kid. I mean, my general rule would probably be like 18, but then puberty blockers younger just to give kids that time to decide and not have to go through puberty that they don't want to. So like again,
but if someone came to
doctor.
you, I'm sure you would talk to just about any young person in their family. But if someone came to you and was like, and I'm sure people probably at this point, you have a pretty big following, you're huge on YouTube, and said, hey, I'm 15 and I want to have surgery. Could you say to me, without knowing who that person is, what you would say? Or would you take it case by case?
Generally, I think it's case by case, but for everything. But for like a 15-year-old, I would generally probably say, I don't think right now is the right time. Yeah. I think probably, let's try puberty blockers. Let's try having you. I mean, I know kids want to gear up really fast and they want to get there really fast and they think they know all of it really fast. And I get that. I was there. I think puberty blockers and being able to explore identities is the first thing, then hormones, then surgeries. If that's generally the progression. But again, I would say, it really does come to case by case basis by like how much the kid is sure, how much they've talked to therapists, how much access to this stuff they would have. But I say as a general rule, I would say 18 for like surgeries, things like that, puberty blockers for younger, hormones, maybe 16, 17, somewhere in that range, once they've had enough time to talk to doctors and stuff.
One more question before I just jump to the Chappelle. I know we've been talking for 40 minutes. Can we keep going?
Yeah, please.
Okay, cool.
Like I said, I'm free for as long as you want to have.
Awesome. So. I'm really enjoying this, and I just have so many things, and I'm taking notes and learning. And the issue around there's a huge difference between obviously transitioning as to woman to man, and there's a lot culturally, there's a lot surgically, there's a lot. But the one thing that is apparently controversial is that if you're born a man, cis man, and transition to a woman, there is a group or an ideology of women especially that will say, listen, you're transitioning from the dominant gender to the more inferior gender culturally, and you don't know what our struggle is. You don't know what it's like to be a woman, and you can't have a period, and you can't, have a baby, and I don't know, just gender norm stuff and sexism. Just in general, and there is a thread of resentment amongst women. Is that a TERF ideology, or is that an ideology that can be named? And what do you have to say about that? And is there a reverse transitioning to a man where there's a similar type of kind of criticism or bigotry?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated too, because I do think like when we talk about TERFs, I tend to use TERFs as like there is a specific ideology behind TERFs, and also TERFs generally tend to be dogmatically attacking the trans community. And I've done whole videos on this. Like there are a lot of TERFs that like align with alt-right groups, dangerous like groups like the Proud Boys, things like that. And also are harass trans people online. So there is a specific ideology when it comes to TERFs. The term has somewhat got diluted to apply to all people that kind of have even an inclination towards that line of thought. But I always tend to think is like the reason sometimes TERFs get a lot of prominence is because the things that they're saying resonate with people in understandable ways. As you say that, like this idea that, I, as a trans woman, when I was born, I did have what we would call male privilege. And that is true. Like there were probably things because I was seen as a boy that I was given privilege in. Like, even noticing after I've transitioned, in work environments, I have to speak louder now and speak more, more often just to like have my voice heard as much as I was when I was seen as a guy. Like I literally noticed at a job, I was working at Starbucks when I transitioned, and I was a manager at the time, which again, maybe I was, because I was seen as a boy, maybe I was hired to be a manager, supervisor, I should say, because I was seen as a boy. And if I was seen as a girl, despite the same qualifications, maybe I would not have gotten that job. And that is 100% true. But I noticed after I transitioned at the job, I would have to say things more than once. I would have to say things louder and speak up for myself in meetings when we had like store meetings, just because I was now starting to be seen as a girl. And so there definitely was a sense of like, I probably had some benefits and privileges given to me because I was seen as a guy. Two things that I would say to that, though. One, I was dealing with a lot of stuff inside that was like, I was depressed and suicidal at certain points. And so that is part of that experience. So just know that like, while yes, I did have certain privileges put up on me, there was it was more like I was playing. People say that me transitioning to be a woman is the costume. For me, it felt like me being a boy was the costume. That every day I had to wake up and play this role that didn't feel like me, and no one got to see the real me. I was just a person that the only time I got to be me maybe was when I was at home alone in the closet in my room, you know?
Yeah. And I think you've made that point beautifully different ways in our conversation, like 3 times. And I think it really resonates with me, because the bottom line is people can judge whatever they want. They can say whatever they want. But the bottom line should be like, listen, I'm happier this way. I'm happier as this. And can you not support that?
Yeah.
Can you just not support that I'm happier wearing this, being this, identifying this? What is that taking from you? And I think you've done that really well.
And I do want to apologies if I may, just to make one quick point.
Oh, go ahead.
Off of that, like the other bit of that though is, you know, you don't know what, like for me, before I transitioned, people would say like, you don't know what it's like to be a woman and have to suffer as like a cis woman does, that they've been told from birth to not speak up for themselves, to experience sexism, to be sexualized. That is true. And I actually remember when I was transitioning and it started to come out, one of the friends that I told was someone who was seen as a girl. And I cried because it's like, do I have the right? Do I have the right to be a woman because she would talk to me all the time about like, you know, being a nerd and not being respected as much in nerdy spaces as I hung out with nerds. I'm being like, oh, you're not seen as like you're not a real nerd because she was seen as a girl. And I would hear that and understand that and be like, do I have the right to transition to be a woman when I've never felt that struggle? And she made a really good point when she says, people are going to like, don't not be happier because other people treat people shitty. Like people are going, and when you transition, people are going to start treating you shittily. And she was right. Like I get that, like I get told like I'm not a real nerd. I get told that I get sexualized. Like I walked to the 7-Eleven a few nights ago and there was a dude like creepily hitting on me when I was like just picking up like some snacks or stuff during the middle of the day. Like that happens. But it's like we shouldn't not try. Are you saying we should not hit on people getting snacks at a 7-Eleven? I mean, there's some times of the day. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, no, it's like people are going to treat you shitty. People are going to treat you shitty, but we don't not pursue what makes us happy because people treat us shittily. And I think what the conversation shouldn't be trans people haven't experienced the shittiness of being a woman from birth, and therefore they're not really women. The conversation should be how should we all fight together, trans people, cis people, trans women, cis women, to stop that from happening overall. I think also just to, being treated shittily, I think brings up a lot of different ideas and behaviors. But I also think that the more, I hate to punch up what you're saying, but I think the more specific thing would be to be objectified sexually, and men and women are objectified sexually more. I've always objectified women sexually. I still do. And I see an attractive woman and I think about having sex with her as opposed to treating like a sexual vessel. And I have to do a process and be like, good Lord, you grow up. But men often, I'll never forget when I realized what I'd been doing my whole life, when a gay man objectified me. And I remember, I've told the story before to regular listeners, but I remember reacting like something's wrong with this guy. He's a pervert. And I was like, oh no, he's not a pervert. He's just being a man. He's just sexualizing me. And I've never felt that way, unfortunately, maybe by a woman. Like women don't generally do that to me. And then I realized, oh my God, I've been doing that to women my whole life. It's not. And so if I'm feeling creeped out by the way he's looking at me and talking to me and even touching me, then now I know. So I've just like objectification is the point I'm trying to make. And I hadn't experienced that much until I did from a man, actually. So yeah, no, I mean, like in our culture, like men are taught from birth to view women and other people as things for them to enjoy, right? Like we've seen in movies, TV shows, books, things like, oh, like look at how hot and sexy this woman is or other people are, and like people are there to be used by you for your benefit. Not that's like oversimplifying it, but that's the general idea. Whereas women are taught generally to think of other people. They're taught to think about like, oh, how do I care for this person? How do I think about this person? Right. And to think externally in that way. And so I wouldn't necessarily even say like there's a longer conversation that men are inherently that way, but I think it's just how we're raised. No, that's well said. And it's also not to say that women can't objectify men. Of course they can. Yeah. Again, I objectify Starfleet characters all the time. So sorry, I'm going to make stupid Star Trek jokes. That's who I am.
They're all welcome. All of them are welcome. And so finally, I just want to talk to you about the Dave Chappelle special, and because you have this amazing video, which I was introduced to your work on, and it is so nuanced, and you play clips and talk about them. And I highly recommend that if you're interested in this part of our conversation, you go over to Jessie Gender on YouTube, subscribe, and learn as I did. So, but I just want to kind of talk about it more generally, not only about Chappelle, although I think race matters. And yes, we're white people talking about race, and you constantly refer to that and take that into account in your videos and in your work. But while I think that's important, I just want to talk about comedy and language. What is, when you watch that special, do you think he's doing damage? Do you think he's putting trans people in danger? Can we, in an effort to make people laugh and maybe make them think, also do damage to actual real lives and bodies?
I think yes and no to a degree. We tend to, in these conversations, like the conversation is somewhat boiled down to like Chappelle good, Chappelle bad, right? Like that you're either on one side, it's like Chappelle was transphobic and hated trans people, or Chappelle was perfect and wasn't hating on trans people. How dare you say that he was even trying to be anything cruel to trans people in any sort of sense? And it's like that's so limiting to what the conversation is,
right?
Because I look at like what Chappelle, and this is what I kind of try to talk about in the video. It's like I look at what Chappelle was trying to talk about in the show, and I saw many jokes that he made that were imperfectly worded, maybe, sure, that didn't fit with like the perfect exact way to talk about trans people, but we're coming from a place of like totally wish to accept and understand trans people. Like he has a really funny, I think a really good joke about how in the special where he was talking about like, if I see a trans person in the bathroom come up to the urinal next to me, I'd rather it be a trans man, someone who looks like a man who may have a vagina. I'd rather that than, a trans woman who looks like a woman next to me in the urinal and who may have a penis. Like
he said I think he said meaty penis.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I thought was funny.
It is. And that is. And like the point with that joke is like, did he say everything perfectly? No. But two things with that is like, one, his intention with that joke was to be like, trans people should be allowed to use the bathroom they want. That was the intention with the joke. And the way he worded it, while it may not, like, as me as a trans person who's steeped in the trans community, he knows how to like say everything perfectly about trans people every single day, would be like, that rubs me the wrong way a little bit, like saying, oh, a meaty penis sort of thing. Like that might rub me the wrong way. No, pun intended, screw it. But I know that the way he said that is relatable to people like you, like people who don't have a ton of experience with the trans community. Right. And so, he may word it in a way that isn't perfect, but his intention is to be kind and caring and thoughtful to the trans community. So there are those jokes. But then there are jokes like the ones where he says he's like defending J.K. Rowling and saying he's on Team TERF and things like that. And as I said before, again, while I understand I can relate to where he's coming from on that, in the sense that like TERFs are sometimes very difficult to explain and their ideology is sometimes very difficult to explain, and their whole purpose, like what they try to do is obfuscate the way they talk about trans issues as like just normal feminism. But TERFs are a dogmatic hate group. Like I said, we tend to dilute the term TERF and calling anyone who uses the word TERF, anyone who just gets things wrong a TERF. But TERFs as a group, generally, they have worked to try to limit the rights of trans people, and also, by the way, hurt women in general as well. Like, for example, there is a TERF group called the WOLF in the United States that works with the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative group that has worked to limit the rights of women's accesses to abortions and things like that. Because TERFs, again, using the term in terms of like the group, they would rather work to harm trans women because that's where they sort of see their ability to do something. I mean, I talked about this in the whole video, but TERFs are a group of people that generally have a lot of trauma coming from them being women. Like maybe they've been assaulted, maybe they've been, not all of them. I don't want to like overgeneralize in that way, but there's a lot of like sense that like, oh, I've been harmed because I'm a woman. They essentialize it that way, generally in like their bodies and being able to give birth and things like that, and say, how do I fight back? Well, I can push back against trans people because they're a target that I can actually, do work against because they're already kind of marginalized. And I don't think they do this consciously. They're like, I hate trans people because I can win against them. But it's hard to win against the patriarchy. It's hard to win against these sort of things because it's ubiquitous in our society. And so you want to feel like a sense of control. And so it's easier to go that way. Anyways, that's an oversimplification of a lot of these. I guess my point being is like the TERFs are a dogmatic hate group that often tend to attack trans people. And so when Dave Chappelle makes that joke in his special and saying, I'm on Team TERF, it normalizes that it's okay to say these people are okay in what they're doing in the harassment of the trans community. And so it gets into this difficult place when we talk about Dave Chappelle, because I don't want to simplify the conversation to Dave Chappelle is good, Dave Chappelle is bad. Yeah. What I want to do is talk about, like, I feel like his where he's coming from about the trans community is incredibly relatable to a lot of people who do not understand trans issues.
Yeah.
But I also want us to look, and so I get that, and that's worthwhile. But I also want to look at, like, he is a man who has a big platform, has a big special that people are talking about, listening to, and for him to use that to normalize a group of people that are so dogmatically attacking trans people, that can do harm. And I've already seen it do harm. I mean, for me specifically, like on my Dave Chappelle video, which again, my whole video is not to cancel Chappelle. I got messages that I posted on my Twitter just to show people it wasn't like to hate on these people. Like I have no interest in being like, screw these people. I'm not an angry person.
I sense that. Yeah, no, I really sense that about you. Go ahead.
But yeah, it was more just like, this makes me sad.
Yeah.
I got messages from people that were just saying, 41% yourself. I'll see you in the 41%. And what that refers to is there is a study that the science of it is wonky, but there's a study that 41% of trans people have committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide in their life. Oh. So when people post that on my video,
they want you to kill yourself.
Yes. And that is something that's directly happened to me, harassed me. I know that, and I've had experience with that. I've gotten death threats throughout my life. You know, I used to work for The Advocate, an LGBTQ magazine. I try to educate about trans issues. I would get death threats, like express death threats, things like that. There are other trans people that don't have the protection or like sense of a thick skin that I've built up over time.
Yeah, you have a confidence about yourself that you're kind of past the point that a stranger can wish horrible things on you and you're going to internalize them. But that's my sense. But I mean, it's still hard. I mean, I've gotten a taste of this just being a public person, and I got called a pedophile for a week once, and a lot of people told me to kill myself, and I was just like, it just made me sad that there are people who would say such things more than anything else, and I think that it's good that you share that and make that transparent because of what you're saying. But you're also saying that there's a whole bunch of people that identify as trans that if they're told that in any one way, if you 41% them, it's going to do damage, and they might actually kill themselves. I mean, we've seen this over and over, sadly.
And it even should be said that Dave Chappelle does even bring this up in his special. He mentions the story of a trans woman who was his friend, who was a comedian, who he mentioned in one of his previous specials in 2019. And, he says in the special that, she defended him after the special because he also made trans jokes there. And she was harassed online. And then a week or so after the special aired, she unfortunately killed herself. And he, in the special, places that on the trans community and LGBTQ allies. And, there's a larger conversation between like the many mixture of things that, even the roommate of the trans woman posted something today. I think it's the anniversary of her death today or close to. She posted things saying like she doesn't know if Dave Chappelle's special was the reason. There was a lot of other things that she went through, trauma in her life and pain in her life. Again, trans people are often marginalized in that way, as we were speaking about before. But I think the other issue that I had with the way Chappelle framed things in the special was he tended to frame things as like one community versus the other. The black community versus the LGBTQ community.
That was so beneath him. It's so beneath him to not take into account intersectionality. And most importantly, it would seem the most marginalized subgroup of trans people is trans women. At least that's what I hear about the headlines. I cover
especially
news.
Black trans women.
Black trans women being killed. And according to this trans writer, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her or respect her work. I think her name is Raquel Wilson, who's a black trans woman. She says mostly by black men. So like we need to, the black community can talk about that and I'll watch and stay on the sidelines. But Dave Chappelle is a leader and an influencer and a thought leader. And so the fact that he excludes that there are black trans people that are being targeted for violence and killed, and just overall that he of all the issues that he went after an almost powerless group of people, to me, it's just like it's so beneath him and petty to me that he didn't talk about black trans people specifically. Yeah.
And I think what we need to talk about with this sort of stuff is not how we frame the argument as against each other, because like, I just mentioned, I've gotten harassment. Dave Chappelle mentioned that a trans woman defended him who was seen as like on the opposite side of the culture war, got harassment. And I think it's not, people tend to use this to paint like people have, I don't want to put these words in his mouth necessarily, but people have taken what he has said to, and I've seen it in my own comments and things like that, to say like, how dare the trans community harass this poor woman and get her to kill herself? The trans community is awful. Whereas if I wanted to, I could go back and write back at them and say like, there are people sending me death threats. Your community is awful. And I don't think that that's helpful. What I think it is like, it's an aspect of the age in which we live in, where everything gets put up in this culture war and everything needs to be, you're the worst person, go kill yourself. Yeah. And I think what it needs to be is like, we need to have conversations that are imperfect, that recognize like there are always going to be people on both sides, crazy people on both sides of any issue that are going to be like, go kill yourself. And I think it's more important to talk about like how certain groups of people are more susceptible to that. Like black trans women, like trans women in general, any marginalized group are going to be more susceptible to, because of the mental stuff that we've had to go through our whole lives, being insulted, being looked down upon, being told to be in the closet, that we're going to be more susceptible to being hurt by that. Also talking about intersectionality, how it's not the LGBTQ community versus the black community, but also how there are black people in the LGBTQ community, there are LGBTQ people in the black community, how that intersects, how within the LGBT community is not a monolith, like TERFs often self-identify as lesbians, not all of them, but a large portion of them, and then try to actively push up trans people from the trans community. Like there's a group in the UK called the LGB Alliance, specifically trying to push trans people out of the community. So it's all about how all these things interact and how we can have conversations. Yeah. And the one final bow that I'll put on that is what I think is really good about Dave Chappelle's special is that he tries to have that conversation in an imperfect way that is relatable to a lot of people. And I appreciate that. And I think when he targets that imperfect way, he has the conversation in ways that are creating the conversation, like he does with the bathroom joke, I think it is a really, really helpful special. But when he targets that in a way that promotes the groups of people that actively do harm, like when he says he's on Team TERF, that is where I think it promotes the conversation that is detrimental. And when he also promotes things like, oh, it's the trans community versus the black community, that's also where it's detrimental. And so that's ultimately, at the end of this, is why I think it's not good to talk about Dave Chappelle's special bad, Dave Chappelle's special good, to put it in those limited terms. It's about talking about how we can look at that special and say where he got things right, where he got things wrong, how we can continue this conversation that doesn't fall into attacking each other. But unfortunately, what is sad is that because he is a man with a big platform on Netflix, because our culture is so divided right now, that conversation isn't happening. It just gets utilized in this way. And so it is somewhat of an onus on him, I think, as a man who understands that his conversation, he's experienced this before, who knows that his work is going to be put in that culture war conversation. I think it's on him to do some work to make sure that he targets the conversation in the right way. And I think in some ways he did, in some ways he didn't. And so I feel like there is a sense of like, I'm not here to condemn Chappelle, but I am here to say like, you need to be held a little bit accountable for why you didn't necessarily do the research on this. I think
your analysis of it and framing of it is very comprehensive and nuanced. And I think that the most important thing, the thing doesn't get said enough, and I'm hearing this as you're talking, is if we're talking about an hour comedy special or an issue, it is fair that several things can be right at once. Like there can be conflicting points of view about such things. People are complex, and that's why, but what creates the division of a culture is in many ways, I mean, it's always been there, but social media and our reactions to it. And, it's like, I don't know if you're following the football coach, John Gruden, and his comments. No. This is a white football coach who said sexist and racist things, and he's been fired by the Raiders. Do you know where the Raiders play?
See, you ask me about Star Trek, I'll have a billion things where you talk to me about football, I'll be like, they throw
what
the ball
city,
through
Jesse,
the hoop and their goal.
What city did the Raiders recently move to? This is for 50 points.
Oh my gosh. Oh no.
Come
You're
on.
gonna make
do you want a hint? Do you want to phone a friend?
Los Angeles?
You are wrong. They moved from Los Angeles. Actually, did they move from Los Angeles? No, I don't know. Oakland. They're now in Las Vegas. Las Vegas is a pro.
I got one word right? Or that's fine. Close.
Listen, I so appreciate your time. I cannot wait to talk to you again. I also kind of can't wait to watch your next video, which is, I would just say, even better than listening to Jessie talk to me is just watching her, videos. Did I do it right? Go subscribe right now to Jessie Gender. I've learned so much, and I really hope that you'll continue to contribute to my discussion because it's really, really great and thoughtful and totally honest and brilliant. And I'm super excited to talk to you again. And I can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun, and I really appreciate a chance to talk to you.
Stand up. There you go, everybody. Jessie Gender. The first time, definitely check out, the first time on Stand Up, definitely check out her videos on YouTube. Support her on Patreon. That's how she pays the bills if you liked her. And definitely going to have her back to talk about this and more. So smart, so thoughtful, so honest, vulnerable, and I really enjoyed that. I hope you did too. The whole idea of this program is to try to learn together each and every day, and including our own ignorance about issues, which I have plenty of. So thank you so much for your support, and I'm very excited to bring you tomorrow Tim Wise and hopefully Christian Finnegan will get back on and much more. Who would you like for me to interview? Who should I have on the show? What do you want to learn about? standupwithpete@gmail.com. And if you aren't signed up for a subscription yet, then what are you waiting for? standupwithpete.com. Check it out right now and sign up for a paid subscription, else I can't do the show. Okay, now it's time for me to put this baby to bed and let John Carroll sing me to sleep. Ladies and gentlemen, singer-songwriter, Grammy Award winner, the great John Carroll would Stand Up. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Love you guys. Before the change could begin, they had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. It's his time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up, stand up, got to stand up. Ooh, come on, just stand up.